The crystal chandeliers of the imperial room cast sharp, cold light across the table as Ki Sung-joon sat across from his high-ranking lieutenants, the weight of his tailored suit jacket feeling like a suit of armor he was never allowed to remove. On the table before him sat a gold-plated fountain pen, a tool for signing death warrants and multi-million-dollar contracts. It represented everything his lineage demanded: absolute control, ruthless expansion, and a life devoid of sentiment. The docks in Busan are secured, his associate's voice droned on, sounding like a distant buzz against the backdrop of soft violin music. Sung-joon nodded, his expression a mask of bored stone, his mind already calculating the next move in a game that never ended. Sung-joon's gaze drifted across the dining room with the predatory instinct of a man who lived in the crosshairs. He watched the other patrons, wealthy couples laughing over vintage wine, businessmen celebrating mergers, people who slept soundly at night, a luxury he hadn't tasted in years. Then, a server stepped into his periphery to present the leather bill folder. Time didn't just slow, it fractured. As she reached out, the hem of her white uniform sleeve hitched back, and his heart slammed against his ribs with the force of a lead pipe. There, marring the smooth, dark skin of her palm, was a jagged, silver line of scar tissue, a ghost of a night in a rain-slicked alleyway when a blade meant for his heart had found her hand instead. He looked up, his breath hitching in a way that made his lieutenants pause mid-sentence. Standing there with a professional, distant composure was Olivia Pearl. Her hair was swept back in a tight, severe bun, her face weary but beautiful, showing the strain of a life spent in the service of people like him. She didn't offer a smile, she offered only the bill. But it was the movement in the hallway behind her that made Sung-joon's world tilt off its axis. A small girl, no more than 3 years old, peeked around the corner of the kitchen door, waiting for her mother. The child scowled at a busboy with a fierce, stubborn intensity, and Sung-joon's blood turned to fire. Looking back at him from that tiny, defiant face were his own obsidian eyes. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant had barely clicked shut behind Ki Sung-joon before the mask of the composed businessman shattered. He ignored the frantic bows of the floor manager, his strides long and predatory as he reached his waiting black sedan. "Find her," he barked at Min-ho, his head of security. "I want her address, her history for the last 4 years, and I want to know whose name is on that child's birth certificate. You have 1 hour." It took less than 40 minutes. The report led Sung-joon far from the neon-soaked skyline of Gangnam and into a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz. This was the part of the city where the shadows were deep and the air tasted of exhaust and damp concrete. He stood at the edge of a narrow alley, watching a dilapidated brick apartment complex that looked like it was being held together by nothing more than grit and peeling paint. Min-ho spoke softly from behind him, his voice uncharacteristically grim. "Her name is Olivia Pearl. She's currently working 3 jobs, the breakfast shift at a diner in the East District, a cleaning gig for a corporate firm at Sunset, and the dinner service where you saw her tonight. She's been behind on rent for 3 months." Sung-joon's jaw tightened until it ached. He thought of the silk sheets he slept on and the blood money that sat stagnant in his vaults while the woman who had bled for him was working herself into a ghost. Suddenly, a movement at a second-story window caught his eye. The glass was cracked and taped over, but through the gap in the thin, yellowed curtains, he saw them. Olivia was still in her server's vest, her shoulders slumped with a fatigue that looked bone-deep. She was kneeling on a frayed rug, patiently feeding a small girl, Chloe, a bowl of steaming white rice. The girl laughed, reaching up to tug at a loose strand of Olivia's hair, and for a fleeting second, the weariness vanished from Olivia's face, replaced by a fierce, protective radiance. Sung-joon watched the scene, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw the way the child moved, the way she tilted her head when she was curious, a mirror image of his own subconscious habits. He had intended to keep her safe by leaving her. Instead, he had left her to drown. "Prepare the accounts," Sung-jun whispered, his eyes never leaving the window. "She's not spending another night in this grave." The next evening, the air in the imperial room felt heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by the static of an approaching storm. Ki Sung-jun sat at the same corner table, his presence a silent command that kept the rest of the staff at a distance. When Olivia finally approached, her movements were a study in practiced neutrality. She placed the bill folder on the table without meeting his eyes, her scarred hand steady, though the pulse at the base of her throat betrayed her. Sung-jun didn't look at the total. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a stack of high-denomination bills, tucked neatly into the leather fold. It wasn't a tip, it was a ransom for the 3 years of struggle he had seen through her window the night before. "Keep it," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. Olivia paused, her fingers grazing the leather. She opened the folder just enough to see the thickness of the cash, an amount that could pay her rent for a year and clear the debt that kept her awake at night. For a heartbeat, her composure wavered. Then, her jaw set into a line of pure iron. "I can't accept this, sir," she said, her voice dropping the professional mask for something sharper. "It's a gratuity for exceptional service," Sung-jun countered, his dark eyes boring into hers. Olivia leaned in closer, her voice a lethal whisper that didn't reach his associates. "We both know what this is. You think you can drop back into my life after 4 years of silence and buy your way out of the guilt? You think 5 figures makes up for the nights I spent wondering if you were dead or if I just wasn't worth a goodbye?" She snapped the folder shut and pushed it back toward him across the white linen. The rejection stung worse than the blade that had caused her scar. "I don't want your blood money, Sung-jun," she breathed, using his name for the first time, a sound that made his heart stutter. "I survived without you when I had nothing. I'm certainly not going to start needing you now." She turned on her heel, leaving the folder, and the man who thought he could control the world, shaken and silent in the shadows of the flickering candlelight. Ki Sung-jun watched from the tinted depths of his sedan as Olivia stepped out of her apartment the following morning, her face a mask of exhaustion. She approached her battered, 10-year-old sedan, bracing herself for the usual ritual of a sputtering engine and a cloud of black smoke. But when she turned the key, the car hummed to life with a purr it hadn't possessed in years. She paused, her hand frozen on the steering wheel, a flicker of confusion crossing her brow as she glanced at the new tires and the lack of a grinding belt. By noon, the miracles began to multiply. When she stopped at the local grocery store, the clerk informed her that a community grant had prepaid her account for the next 6 months. When she arrived at the diner for her second shift, her landlord called to tell her the back rent, and the next 3 months, had been cleared by an anonymous donor. From a distance, Sung-jun leaned against a brick wall, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He was a man who moved mountains with a phone call, yet he felt like a thief, stealing her burdens because he wasn't allowed to share them. He watched her through the diner window, she wasn't smiling. Instead, she stood by the coffee station, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes darting toward the street with a sharp, hunted look. She wasn't relieved, she was terrified. In her world, nothing was ever free, and good luck was usually the bait for a trap. That evening, as she walked toward the high-end restaurant for her final shift, she spotted the black sedan idling a block away. She didn't keep walking. She marched straight to the car and rapped her knuckles against the reinforced glass. The window slid down with a silent, mechanical hiss, revealing Sung-jun's stoic face. "Stop it," she snapped, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, jagged fury. "I told you I don't want your charity. Do you think I'm so weak that I can't see your fingerprints all over my life? Every time my car starts, I see you. Every time I look at my daughter's full plate, I see the blood on your hands. I am trying to keep you safe," he said, his voice a low vibration. "You're making me a target," she countered, leaning in so close he could smell the faint scent of vanilla and kitchen grease. "Shadows don't protect people, Sung-jun. They just hide the monsters." She turned and walked away, leaving him in the dark, realizing for the first time that his power was the very thing keeping him exiled from her heart. The following night, Sung-jun did not take his usual seat at the corner table. He waited until the final guest had departed and the closed sign had been flipped, casting the gilded dining room into a tomb-like silence. He emerged from the shadows of the foyer just as Olivia was wiping down the mahogany bar, her movements stiff and rhythmic. She didn't startle when she saw him. She merely set her cloth down, her eyes weary. "The kitchen is closed, Sung-jun. Go home to your empire." "I am not here for a meal, Olivia," he said, stepping into the light. The sharp lines of his suit seemed out of place against the mundane reality of closing chores. "I am here because you speak of my hands being stained, yet you forget it was those same hands that held you when the world was burning. Why do you fight me?" "I am trying to restore what was taken." Olivia let out a short, jagged laugh that echoed off the crystal stemware. "Restore? You think I'm mourning a paycheck? When you disappeared, you didn't just take your protection or your money. You took the girl who believed that if you loved someone enough, the world couldn't touch you." She walked around the bar, stopping inches from him. The scent of expensive cologne and cheap floor cleaner clashed in the air between them. "I was a rising star in culinary school, Sung-jun. I had dreams of my own kitchen. But after that night in the alley, after I took that blade and you paid my hospital bill only to vanish, I became a liability. Your enemies didn't just go away. They made sure no reputable place would hire me. They made me a ghost." She held up her scarred hand, the silver line shimmering under the dim track lighting. "I didn't lose a career. I lost the ability to look at a stranger without wondering if they were sent by you, or meant to hurt me because of you. You broke my faith in every kindness, every promise, and every person I've met since. You want to fix something? Give me back the 4 years I spent looking over my shoulder every time Chloe laughed too loud." Sung-jun reached out, his fingers trembling near her cheek, but he stopped himself, his hand hovering in the cold air. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city found himself without a single word to trade for his sins. The following afternoon, Sung-jun found himself standing outside a small community park, his presence a jarring anomaly among the brightly colored slides and the sound of children's laughter. He had watched Olivia drop Chloe off before her cleaning shift, and now he stood by the chain-link fence, his heart doing something it hadn't done in decades, trembling. Chloe was sitting in the sandbox, fiercely defending a lopsided castle from an imaginary dragon. As Sung-jun approached, his shadow fell over her work. Most children shrunk away from his stature, sensing the coldness that radiated from his soul, but Chloe merely looked up, squinting against the sun. "You're blocking my light," she said, her voice small but possessed of a terrifyingly familiar clarity. Sung-jun knelt, heedless of the dust settling on his $1,000 wool trousers. Up close, the resemblance was an physical ache in his chest. It wasn't just the shape of her eyes or the arch of her brow, it was the way she set her jaw, the same stubborn defiance that had helped him build an empire. "I apologize," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gentle frequency he didn't know he possessed. "It looks like a very important castle." Chloe tilted her head, her dark eyes scanning his face with a sudden, unnerving intensity. She didn't look away. Instead, she crawled closer, her small hand reaching out to touch the fabric of his coat. "You have the same eyes as the man in my drawing," she whispered. Sung-jun felt the ice boss, the man who had ordered executions without blinking, shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. "What man?" "The one Mama says is a star," she replied, her thumb brushing against his cheek. She says he's far away so he can keep us safe. But you're right here. For the first time in his life, Sung-jun felt the crushing weight of his choices. He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving with extreme caution as he tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. Chloe didn't flinch, she leaned into the touch, a simple gesture of trust that felt more powerful than any oath of loyalty he had ever received. In that moment, the empire didn't matter. The blood debt didn't matter. There was only this child, his eyes, and the sudden, desperate realization that he would burn the city to the ground before he let her live a single day without him again. The piece of the park was a fragile glass ornament, and it shattered the moment Sung-jun noticed the silver sedan idling too long at the curb. His instincts, honed by a decade of survival, screamed a warning. As he stood up from the sandbox, his hand instinctively moved toward the holster hidden beneath his blazer, his eyes sweeping the perimeter. He wasn't just a father in the park anymore, he was a target, and he had just painted a bullseye on the two people he loved most. "Minho, move in," he whispered into his lapel mic. Within seconds, two black SUVs veered onto the grass, flanking the playground. The transition was violent and swift. Before Olivia could even process the sight of Sung-jun standing over their daughter, she was being ushered into the back of a reinforced vehicle. "What is this?" "Sung-jun, let go of her," she screamed, reaching for Chloe as the heavy doors thudded shut, sealing them in a pressurized tomb of leather and steel. "The Dragonhead scouts saw me with her," Sung-jun said, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth he had shown Chloe moments before. "They know you are my blood. To them, you aren't people, you're leverage. If I leave you at that apartment, you won't live to see the sunrise." By nightfall, Olivia found herself standing in the center of a sprawling estate tucked into the rugged cliffs of the coast. The walls were reinforced concrete, the windows were bulletproof glass, and armed men in dark suits paced the perimeter like hungry wolves. It was a marvel of modern security, draped in silk and marble. To Sung-jun, it was a fortress. To Olivia, it was a morgue. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the tide crash against the rocks below. The luxury felt like an insult. "You haven't saved us, Sung-jun," she said, her voice echoing in the hollow expanse of the great room. "You've just traded one kind of danger for another. At the apartment, I was poor, but I was free. Here, I'm just a prize in a vault." Sung-jun watched her from the doorway, the golden light of the chandelier casting long, jagged shadows. He wanted to tell her that this was the only way he knew how to love, to surround something with walls until nothing could hurt it. But as he saw the reflected bars of the window frame across her face, he realized she was right. He hadn't brought them home, he had taken them prisoner. The silence of the safe house was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the high-tech security system, a sound that reminded Olivia of a ticking clock. She found Sung-jun in the library, his jacket discarded, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up as he poured amber liquid into a crystal glass. The ruthless confidence he wore like armor seemed frayed at the edges. "Chloe is asleep," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the stillness. She asked if the men with the guns are there to keep the monsters out, or if the monsters are already inside. Sung-jun didn't turn around. "I am doing what is necessary, Olivia. The world I inhabit doesn't allow for half measures. My enemies are patient, and they are cruel." "Then leave that world," she challenged, stepping into the center of the room. "You talk about protection as if it's a physical wall, but the greatest threat to Chloe isn't a rival gang. It's you. It's the life you lead, the shadow you cast, and the fact that as long as you are the ice boss, she will always be a target." Sung-jun finally turned, his eyes dark with a mix of frustration and pain. "You think it's that simple? To just walk away from an empire? This is my bloodline. This is the only way I can guarantee you have everything you need. We don't need an empire, Sung-jun. We need a father who doesn't smell like gunpowder when he hugs his daughter, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. She took a final step toward him, her scarred hand reaching out not to touch him, but to point toward the door. This is my ultimatum. You can have your throne, or you can have us. But you cannot have both. You cannot bring the blood of the streets into our home and call it love. If you choose that life, then let us go back to our struggle. I'd rather raise her in poverty and peace than in a palace built on graves. She left him standing in the middle of his fortress, the glass of whiskey untouched on the table. For the first time, Ki Sung-jun realized that his greatest victory wouldn't be won through violence or wealth, but through the courage to become a nobody. The transition did not happen with a handshake, it happened with a fire. Ki Sung-jun convened the council of elders in a room that smelled of ancient cedar and unspoken threats. He did not come as their leader, but as a man settling a debt. On the table, he placed the ledger of every offshore account, every hidden port, and every political connection he had spent a decade cultivating. To the men who lived for power, it was a king's ransom. To Sung-jun, it was the weight of 1,000 anchors finally being cut loose. I am leaving, he stated, his voice as cold as the winter sea. The empire is yours to divide. In exchange, my name, my face, and the lives of those I choose to walk with are to be erased from your records. If a single shadow of this life touches them, the fail-safes I've planted will dismantle everything you see here within 24 hours. The air in the room curdled with the shock of his betrayal, but Sung-jun stood his ground, a ghost already. He watched as they reached for the ledger, the same greed that made them powerful made them predictable. He was trading a throne for a life of anonymity, and to these men, it was a bargain they couldn't refuse. Outside, the cleansing began. His private security team, those few who chose to stay with him, executed the final protocol. Digital footprints were scrubbed. Deeds were transferred. By midnight, the black sedans were replaced by a nondescript SUV. Sung-jun stood on the pier of his coastal estate and watched as a small, controlled fire consumed his tailored suits, his burner phones, and the photographs of the man he used to be. He arrived back at the safe house as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. He wasn't wearing a tie, and the top buttons of his shirt were open, revealing the tension in his collarbone. He found Olivia standing in the kitchen, a packed bag by her feet, ready to run if he had chosen the wrong path. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket and placed a set of keys on the counter, keys to a modest property in a city where no one knew the name Ki Sung-jun. The throne is gone, he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he had never allowed. There is no more blood on the walls. There is only us. The heavy, oppressive silence of the Mafia underworld was replaced by the rhythmic, comforting clatter of a kitchen in motion. 6 months later, the air was no longer thick with the scent of gunpowder and expensive whiskey. Instead, it smelled of roasting garlic, toasted sesame, and the sweet, sharp tang of ginger. The bistro was small, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where the morning sun hit the storefront just right, reflecting off the gold lettering on the window, Pearl and June. It wasn't an empire, but it was theirs. Ki Sung-jun, once a man whose presence made generals tremble, now stood at a small wooden table in the back corner of the dining room. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit or a concealed holster. Instead, he wore a simple charcoal apron over a rolled-up linen shirt. He sat huddled on a chair that was much too small for him, his brow furrowed in intense concentration as he looked over a first-grade workbook. 7 + 5 is 12, Chloe whispered, looking up at him with those familiar, defiant eyes that were now filled with nothing but curiosity. Right, Daddy? Exactly right, Sung-jun replied, his voice a warm, low rumble. He reached out and tapped the page, his large hand gentle. "You're as fast with numbers as your mother is with a chef's knife." In the open kitchen, Olivia moved with a grace that was no longer shadowed by the fear of being watched. She tossed a pan of fusion noodles, the flames leaping up in a vibrant dance. As she reached for a plating spoon, the sleeve of her chef's coat pulled back, revealing the silver line of the scar on her palm. For years, that mark had been a jagged map of trauma and a reminder of a man who had left her in the dark. But as she looked across the steam of the kitchen and caught Sung-jun's eye, the pain of the memory didn't surface. He gave her a small, private smile, the kind of smile he had once traded for power, but now gave away for free. The scar was no longer a wound, it was just a mark of how they had survived to get here. Olivia set the plate down and walked toward the back table, resting her hand on Sung-jun's shoulder. He leaned his head against her, the ice boss finally melted away, replaced by a man who had found his true fortune in a quiet room, a child's laughter, and a life where the only tip that mattered was the one that brought him home.